It was a clear, sunny afternoon in Elmwood Grove, a quaint suburban town. The local park buzzed with energy. Children ran through the grass. Joggers followed winding paths, and friends gathered on blankets under towering sycamore trees. Among them, a young woman named Nora Harper sat alone on a weathered bench near a small pond, her thick hardcover novel open in her hands. A skilled attorney by profession, Nora rarely found time for herself, but today was an exception. Her peaceful reading was disrupted by the screech of tires nearby. A patrol car came to an abrupt stop along the curb, catching the attention of passersby. Two uniformed officers stepped out, their postures stiff, their faces stern. They scanned the area, their gazes settling on Nora, the only person sitting quietly nearby. "Excuse me, miss. Mind if we speak with you for a moment?" the taller officer asked, his tone laced with authority. Nora looked up, her expression calm and curious. "Sure," she replied, carefully marking her page before closing the book. The second officer approached, his voice clipped. "We received a report of suspicious activity in the park. Can you tell us what you're doing here?" Brows furrowed in confusion, Nora answered. "Suspicious activity? I'm just sitting here reading." She held up her book, as if to emphasize her point, but her explanation did little to ease their scrutiny. "Do you have any ID on you?" the taller officer asked, his tone lacking warmth. Nora felt her pulse quicken, though her demeanor remained steady. "Why do you need to see my ID? Have I done something wrong?" she asked, her voice measured but firm. "It's just a routine question," the shorter officer replied, though the pointed looks exchanged between them suggested otherwise. The growing tension drew the attention of others in the park. Nearby picnickers exchanged hushed whispers, while a few people subtly moved closer to watch. Nora, sensing the weight of the moment, reached in her bag and pulled out her wallet. She handed over her ID with a steady hand. "Nora Harper," the taller officer read aloud, as if the name alone held significance. "And what's your purpose here today, Miss Harper?" She sighed, her patience beginning to wear thin. "I live here. I came to the park to enjoy my day off." "Is that a problem?" The officer handed back her ID, but their questioning continued. "Do you often carry books like that around?" one asked, the tone of his question almost mocking. "Are you meeting someone here, or just hanging out alone?" the other officer added, his hand resting conspicuously near his belt. Nora's jaw tightened, but she refused to show her frustration. Her years as an attorney had taught her how to navigate moments like these. "Unless I'm being accused of something, I don't see why I need to answer these questions," she said firmly. The taller officer took a step closer, his voice sharp. "Don't get smart with us. We're just doing our job, and I know the law," Nora responded, her tone steady. "I'm not breaking it by sitting in a public park." Her defiance seemed to ignite something in them. The shorter officer abruptly reached for her arm. "You're resisting," he said sharply, though Nora had not moved an inch. "What are you doing?" she exclaimed, her voice tinged with disbelief as cold metal cuffs clicked around her wrists. The murmurs in the park grew louder, and a man nearby raised his phone to capture the scene on video. "Stop resisting," the officer repeated, his tone louder now, as though trying to legitimize his actions to the growing crowd. Nora's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay calm, even as a mix of humiliation and frustration welled within her. As the officers led her toward their patrol car, the crowd's murmurs turned into shouts of protest. Nora glanced back at the onlookers and locked eyes with a young woman holding up her phone, recording everything. In that moment, an unspoken message passed between them, a silent plea for justice to be served. As the car door slammed shut, Nora took a deep breath. She knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. In the cramped back seat of the patrol car, Nora's thoughts raced. For years, she had fought tirelessly in court for others, championing justice and holding systems accountable. Now, the irony of sitting on the other side of the system wasn't lost on her, though it brought no humor, only a simmering fury. The silence during the ride to the station was oppressive, broken only by the static crackle of the police radio. Nora gazed out the window, her faint reflection blending with the blur of passing streets. The cuffs bit into her wrists, leaving them sore. When they arrived at the station, things only grew worse. The booking process was dehumanizing, stripping her of any semblance of dignity. She was fingerprinted, photographed, and marched into a holding cell under harsh fluorescent lights that hummed incessantly. "Get comfortable," one officer quipped with a smirk as he locked the cell door behind her. Nora sat on the cold metal bench, her hands clasped tightly as she stared at the dull gray walls. She replayed the events in the park over and over, each iteration stoking her frustration. How had a quiet moment of reading spiraled into this nightmare? The answer was obvious and bitter: bias. Hours crawled by before anyone addressed her again. A younger officer, holding a clipboard, approached the cell. "Ms. Harper, you're being charged with resisting arrest and interfering with a public officer," he said mechanically. "On what basis?" Nora demanded, her voice sharper than she intended. "You can bring that up in court," he replied dismissively before turning and walking away. Nora exhaled deeply, trying to steady herself. The accusations were baseless, and she knew it, but the fight ahead would be anything but straightforward. Cases like this never were. When Nora was finally released on bail, the cool night air hit her like a bomb against the suffocating atmosphere of the station. By the curb, her colleague and close friend, Vanessa, was waiting for her. "Nora!" Vanessa rushed over, her voice filled with relief and worry. "Are you all right?" Nora gave a small nod, though the slight tremble in her hands betrayed her. "I'm okay," she replied quietly, though the word felt hollow. As they drove away, silence filled the car. Vanessa kept glancing at her, waiting for her to speak. Eventually, Nora broke the silence. "I'm not letting this go, Vanessa. Not this time." Vanessa's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "What do you mean?" Nora's voice was steady, but her eyes burned with resolve. "I'm tired of this. Tired of it happening to me, to others. I know the law, and I know how to fight back. I have to." That night, Nora sat at her dining table, legal pads spread out around her. She scribbled notes furiously, already forming the framework for a civil rights lawsuit against the officers and their department. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from determination. As the days passed, her resolve only grew stronger. The video of her arrest, filmed by a bystander in the park, had gone viral. Messages of support poured in from strangers who had seen the footage and were moved by her calm resistance and the injustice she faced. Many shared their own stories of unfair treatment, creating a groundswell of solidarity. However, the attention wasn't without its challenges. Nora's firm hesitated to publicly back her, worried it might tarnish their carefully managed image. But she stood her ground, making it clear that this fight was bigger than her. It was about challenging the prejudice and systemic failures that allowed such actions to persist. The viral video had ignited conversations far beyond their small town. Reporters reached out for interviews, but Nora declined them all. She wasn't interested in media coverage. Her focus was on building an airtight case to expose the officer's misconduct. Late at night, when the world went quiet, the weight of it all bore down on her. She relived the moment in the park, the dismissive words, the cuffs, the humiliation. Her mind turned to how much worse things could have been. The thought was both sobering and galvanizing. One evening, Vanessa stopped by unannounced, bringing takeout. She set the food on the table as Nora typed furiously at her laptop. "You've been at this for hours," Vanessa said, concern evident in her tone. "I don't have the luxury of stopping," Nora replied without looking up. Vanessa sat across from her, studying her face. "This isn't just about you anymore," she said softly. "People are watching. They're counting on you." Nora paused, then shut her laptop, meeting her friend's gaze. "I know," she said firmly. "That's why I can't fail." Her preparation was exhaustive. She pored over similar cases, combing through precedents and legal loopholes. She reached out to trusted colleagues, assembling a team that shared her passion for justice. But it wasn't just about legal battles. Nora attended town halls, spoke at community meetings, and listened to others who had endured similar injustices. Her fight became their fight, and the community rallied around her. One afternoon, as she left a meeting downtown, a woman approached her hesitantly. "Ms. Harper?" the woman asked. "Yes." "I just wanted to thank you," the woman said, her voice trembling. "For standing up, for all of us." Nora felt her throat tighten, but managed a small smile. "I'm just doing what I can," she said. The community's support was both empowering and a heavy responsibility. Nora knew she had to see this through, not just for herself, but for the countless others who had faced similar treatment. Then one day, her attorney called with an update. The officers had filed a motion to dismiss the case, a predictable move, one meant to delay proceedings. As her attorney explained the next steps, his tone shifted. "Nora," he said carefully, "there's something else you need to know. You've just been assigned as the presiding judge for one of their cases next month." The irony of the situation was overwhelming. Nora leaned back in her chair, processing the news. After weeks of preparing to hold these officers accountable in court, fate had handed her a chance for a different kind of justice. For a brief moment, she questioned whether she could handle it, whether she could sit on the bench and remain impartial. But then she thought about everything she had endured, about the people looking to her to make a difference. This wasn't just coincidence. It was an opportunity to demonstrate what true justice looked like. The courtroom hummed with quiet anticipation as attendees filtered in, taking their seats. The case itself wasn't sensational. An internal misconduct hearing involving two officers accused of using excessive force in an unrelated incident. To most, it was just another procedural matter in the justice system. Officers Grayson and Miller sat at the defense table, their uniforms pristine, their posture rigid. They spoke in hushed tones, their expressions a mix of disinterest and confidence. To them, this was just another formality, an inconvenience they could easily brush off. But the atmosphere shifted when the door to the judge's chambers opened. Nora emerged, her black robe billowing slightly as she walked to the bench. She moved with purpose, her expression calm but commanding. As she took her seat, her eyes briefly flicked toward the defendants. Their reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Officer Grayson's face turned pale, his eyes widening as recognition dawned. Miller shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening as his gaze darted nervously. It was her, the woman they had arrested in the park. Nora allowed a moment of silence to hang in the air, the weight of the situation settling over the room. Then, in a steady and authoritative tone, she began. "This court is now in session. Please be seated." The officers sank stiffly into their chairs, their previous composure faltering. Grayson leaned toward their attorney, whispering something urgently. The lawyer nodded, his focus remaining on Nora. For the first time in weeks, Nora felt in control. But this wasn't about personal vengeance. Her role as a judge required fairness and impartiality, and she intended to uphold that standard. Still, the irony wasn't lost on her, or anyone else in the room. As the attorneys presented their opening statements, Nora listened attentively, her pen gliding across the notepad in front of her. Occasionally, she glanced at the defendants, noting their fidgeting hands and tense shoulders. During the first recess, Grayson and Miller stepped into the hallway, their voices low but agitated. "How is she the judge?" Grayson muttered, barely containing his frustration. "This has to be some kind of setup," Miller replied, shaking his head. "It's not a setup," their attorney interjected firmly. "It's a coincidence, and it doesn't change anything. What matters is the evidence. Focus on that, not her." But the officers weren't convinced. The surreal nature of their predicament weighed heavily on them, making it impossible to ignore. When the session resumed, Nora maintained her calm professionalism, ensuring the proceedings were conducted fairly. But her mere presence seemed to rattle the officers. Each time she addressed them, their discomfort was palpable, their confidence visibly crumbling. As the prosecutor called witnesses to testify, Nora observed the officers closely. At one point, she noticed Grayson glancing at her, his expression softening into something that resembled regret. It was a fleeting moment, but it lingered in her mind. By the end of the day, the tension in the courtroom was thick. Nora adjourned the hearing with a firm strike of her gavel. "We will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m., she announced. As the courtroom emptied, Nora stayed behind, organizing her notes. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed the officers lingering near the door, as if debating whether to approach her. Ultimately, they left without a word, their steps heavy with unease. The challenge for Nora wasn't the irony of the situation. It was the decisions that lay ahead and the weight of ensuring justice was served. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. Word of the unexpected twist had spread, drawing a larger audience. Some were curious onlookers. Others were there to support Nora, though they knew her role demanded neutrality. She entered with the same composed demeanor as the previous day, her robe flowing as she ascended to the bench. The attorneys wasted no time diving into their arguments. The prosecutor presented evidence methodically, recounting testimony from the victim of the excessive force incident. "Your Honor," the prosecutor stated firmly, "this isn't merely an isolated mistake. The officers' actions demonstrate a troubling disregard for their responsibilities and the rights of the people they are sworn to protect." Nora nodded, absorbing every detail, her pen moving swiftly across her notepad. The defendant's body language grew more rigid under her watchful eye. The defense attorney stood to counter, his tone measured but strained. "Your Honor, while we acknowledge the events in question, it's important to recognize that the situation escalated under circumstances outside of the officers' control. Their actions were not malicious, and we contend the evidence fails to warrant severe consequences." As the debate unfolded, Nora couldn't ignore the parallels between the case and her own experience. The excuses, the justifications, they were painfully familiar. But she remained resolute in setting aside personal feelings, focusing instead on the facts. When it came time for witness testimony, the tension reached its peak. The prosecutor called the victim, a young man named Jordan, to the stand. His voice quavered as he described being thrown to the ground during a routine traffic stop. "They didn't give me a chance to say anything," Jordan explained, his gaze shifting nervously between the lawyers and the officers. "It felt like they already decided I was guilty before I even spoke." The prosecutor leaned forward. "And at any point, did you resist their commands?" Jordan shook his head. "No, I did exactly what they told me to do. But it didn't matter. They weren't listening." The room fell silent as the defense attorney approached for cross-examination, attempting to cast doubt on Jordan's account. But the young man stood firm, refusing to be shaken. Nora watched intently, her expression unreadable. Finally, the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived. The defendants were called to testify. Officer Grayson was the first to take the stand. He shifted nervously as he raised his hand to swear the oath, his voice unsteady as he responded to the prosecutor's opening questions. "Officer Grayson," the prosecutor began, "you stand accused of using excessive force during this incident. Can you explain your actions that night?" Grayson hesitated, casting a quick glance toward Miller before speaking. I thought the situation was escalating. I made a judgment call." "And do you believe that judgment call was justified?" Grayson fidgeted, his discomfort visible. "At the time, yes. But looking back, I see now that I could have handled it differently." The prosecutor leaned in, his tone sharp. "Handled it differently how?" "By not throwing an unarmed, compliant individual to the ground." Grayson's lips parted, but no words came out. The silence that followed was deafening. When Officer Miller took the stand, his demeanor wasn't much better. His attempts to rationalize his behavior only served to bolster the prosecutor's case, highlighting the lack of accountability both officers displayed. Nora sat on the bench, her expression unreadable as she listened to every word. Inside, however, a mix of frustration and sadness churned. These men had been entrusted with authority and used it recklessly, leaving harm and distrust in their wake. As the day unfolded, the evidence against the officers became overwhelming. The prosecutor's closing argument was incisive, urging the court to send a clear message that the misuse of power would not go unchecked. The actions of these officers, the prosecutor declared, are not isolated incidents. They reflect a pattern, a dangerous one, that undermines public trust in those sworn to protect it. We ask the court to hold them accountable, not just for the sake of justice, but for the integrity of the system itself. By contrast, the defense's closing statement was weak. Their arguments lacked cohesion. and even the officers seemed resigned to what was coming. As the hearing ended, Nora struck her gavel with precision, her voice steady as she announced, "This court will reconvene next week for the final ruling." The courtroom emptied slowly. Grayson and Miller lingered by the exit, their faces pale and drawn. It was clear that, for the first time, they understood the severity of their actions and the consequences they now faced. But justice, Nora knew, wasn't simply about punishment. It was about accountability, reform, and ensuring that such abuses of power would not be repeated. The following week, the courtroom was filled to capacity. News of the unexpected twists in the case had spread, drawing reporters and curious onlookers alike. What had started as a misconduct hearing had evolved into a symbol of something much larger, a call for transparency and justice. Nora entered the room with her usual composed demeanor. She ascended the bench, her robe flowing behind her, and addressed the courtroom with calm authority. "This court is now in session." She began her ruling, her voice firm yet measured. "Law enforcement is a cornerstone of our society, entrusted with the responsibility to protect and serve all members of the community. When those in uniform abuse their power, it erodes the very trust that allows the system to function. The actions of Officers Grayson and Miller have demonstrated a troubling disregard for these principles." Nora paused, her gaze sweeping the room. At the defense table, the two officers sat with heads lowered, their earlier arrogance replaced with visible discomfort. The evidence presented has shown beyond reasonable doubt that the force used by Officers Grayson and Miller was unnecessary and unjustified. Such actions not only harm the immediate victim, but also perpetuate distrust and fear within the community. She continued, outlining the penalties: immediate suspension without pay, mandatory retraining programs focused on de-escalation, and a formal disciplinary record that would remain on file. The ruling was firm, balancing accountability with the potential for reform. As Nora delivered her final words, the weight of her decision settled over the courtroom. This ruling is not just a condemnation of the actions taken, but a call for systemic change. We must hold those in power accountable to ensure that justice prevails for all. She struck her gavel decisively. This court is adjourned. As the attendees filed out, Grayson and Miller stood hesitantly. Before leaving, Grayson turned back to Nora, his voice barely audible. "Your Honor, I'm sorry. It wasn't enough to undo the damage, but it was a step forward." Nora nodded slightly, acknowledging his words but offering no absolution. Real accountability, she knew, required actions, not apologies. Later that evening, Nora attended a community forum at the local library. The room was filled with people eager to share their experiences, frustrations, and hopes for the future. One older man approached her afterward, his voice filled with emotion. "Thank you for what you did," he said, gripping her hand tightly. "That ruling, it meant something to all of us." Nora smiled softly, her resolve firm. "This is just the start. We have a long way to go." In the days that followed, conversations about reform gained momentum. Community leaders, activists, and law enforcement officials began meeting to discuss actionable steps for rebuilding trust. Nora, using her platform, advocated for greater accountability and transparency within the system. What had started as one case had grown into a broader push for change. One afternoon, as she left the courthouse, she paused to watch a group of young organizers setting up for a rally. Their signs called for justice, fairness, and reform. In their energy and passion, she saw a glimmer of hope. The fight was far from over, but moments like this reminded Nora that progress, no matter how slow, was possible. Justice wasn't just about verdicts, it was about creating a better future for everyone.